The enemy's fortifications were battered by the trench cannons for a week. Two powerful redoubts dug deeply into the earth were the most forward British position. When the time came to storm those redoubts and transform the siege into an attack, those chosen to lead the daring charge would have the highest honor. Needless to say, Hamilton won it more than life itself. Military etiquette dictated that one redoubt be attacked by the French and the other by the Americans. The American leader to be chosen by Hamilton's longtime friend, General Lafayette, came down to a choice between two commanders in Lafayette's light infantry, Hamilton and Jean-Joseph Sauerbader de Guimat. Guimat was a fellow Frenchman who had joined the American army with Lafayette. Lafayette chose the more battle-hardened Guimat, reasoning that he had more experience. Hamilton went ballistic, storming into Lafayette's tent, shouting that he had more seniority than Guimat, and adding that technically he was officer of the day. Lafayette excused himself by saying the arrangements had been sanctioned by the commander-in-chief. Hamilton wrote a spirited and manly letter to Washington, and when that didn't work, he charged into his tent. Hamilton was lucky once again, as his crisis of personal honor aligned in the instance with American honor. It escaped no one's attention that both of the officers chosen to lead the charge were French. This time Washington was only too happy to give Hamilton the command he demanded. When Hamilton emerged from Washington's tent, he was ecstatic. He embraced his friend and assistant, Major Nicholas Fish, almost jumping into his arms and shouting, "We have it! We have it!" The plan for the assault was simple. Under the cover of night, on a secret signal, 5 bursts of cannon fire, the French and American soldiers were to sneak up on the redoubts because those were surrounded by wooden, barbed wire. Pioneers with axes were to go ahead of the soldiers to clear the path. Hamilton was so overeager that when he looked up in the night sky and saw Jupiter and Venus, he thought it was the signal and almost jumped. When the real signal came at last, Hamilton asked his men for a few brave volunteers. 20 men stepped forward. At that, Hamilton took off at a mad run, sprinting toward the enemy without looking back to see if anyone was behind him. He ran so fast that he reached the walls before a single shot was fired. Far ahead of the pioneers with their heavy axes, Hamilton and his men squeezed through the sharp thicket, pell-mell, in whatever manner they could. The ardor of the troops would not allow them to wait. Hamilton later explained that ardor was no doubt a response to the infectious enthusiasm of their fearless leader. This ability to infect others with enthusiasm is an essential component in charismatic leadership. In contrast, when the French troops reached their redoubt, they waited as ordered for the pioneers. While they stood around exposed to close-range enemy fire, they suffered heavy casualties. The French followed procedure while the Americans hurtled ahead, improvising as they went. Paradoxically, breaking the rules and recklessly surging forward at top speed was the safest course. The outlying British and Hessian garrison of about 60 men surrendered to Hamilton quickly. From the firing of the first shot by the enemy to their surrender was less than 10 minutes, wrote Hamilton. Meanwhile, the French were still mired in their assault, and the Americans were only too happy to graciously offer their assistance. Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, and the war was essentially over. Hamilton put Major Fish in command of his battalion and rode triumphantly home to his family. He rode at such a fast pace that he exhausted his horse and had to switch it for another. Once home, he collapsed and was very sick for 2 months. Hamilton was furious that Congress offered him no form of recognition for what he considered his great heroism at Yorktown. Though it was, after all, only one battle in a long war, his bravery, however, had not escaped the attention of the one man who mattered. Washington praised Hamilton's intrepidity, coolness, and firmness of action. Hamilton won Washington's respect at Yorktown, and the commander-in-chief and the former aide were free to reapproach each other on a more equal footing. Hamilton was Washington's boy no longer. He was a gentleman of recognized honor and valor, just as he had always dreamed of being. Constitutional warrior. Losing it in Philadelphia. The war was over. America was no longer a colony, but it was not yet a country. It is precisely at this point that most revolutions stumble, and it was by no means inevitable that ours would succeed. Washington saw disaster unfolding before his eyes. In 1786, he wrote to Madison, "No morn ever dawned more favorably than ours did, and no day was ever more clouded than the present." America continued to stumble along under the Articles of Confederation, a loose constitution of sorts drafted hastily in 1777. It had numerous flaws. Most notably, it provided no way to fund the federal government with anything but voluntary contributions from the states. In recent years, even those had dried up. By 1787, only 2 or 3 states paid anything at all. Most state assemblies wouldn't even discuss financial requests from Congress. It was too politically unpopular while the country was in an economic depression. Hamilton said things are continually growing worse. Having long kept Congress on short rations, the states seem about to deny it sustenance altogether. Washington had characterized the country as limping along under the Articles of Confederation, always moving upon crutches and tottering at every step. By 1787, it was not merely tottering but falling down the stairs. One man who was happy to give it a shove was George Clinton, governor of Hamilton's home state of New York. Clinton was the archetype of the party boss. The old Irishman ran New York like a personal fiefdom, dispensing thousands of patronage jobs to his extended family and supporters. He had no desire to surrender any power to a federal government. Hamilton was determined to stop Clinton from sabotaging the country. Twice, Congress had tried to obtain authorization to open a stream of federal revenue, a 5% tariff on all imports called an impost. All 13 states needed to agree. Rhode Island had blocked the impost bill in 1781. In 1783, the one spoiler to derail the impost was Clinton's New York. Now in 1786, Congress was making a third desperate attempt. 12 of the 13 states had approved it, and New York was once again the sole holdout. In January 1787, now a New York assemblyman, Hamilton stood on the floor of the assembly. He made an impassioned, brilliant speech lasting several hours in support of the impost that left him doubled up in pain and exhaustion. Though it must have been a moving scene, the Clintonians were unmoved. Literally, no one bothered to rise from his chair to refute Hamilton. They didn't have to. A voice vote was called, as if Hamilton hadn't even spoken, and the impost was killed. New York's defeat of the impost seemed to be the death knell to the Confederation. Quite simply, the federal government could no longer function, and incensed Henry Knox, then Secretary of War, exclaimed, every liberal good man is wishing New York in hell. Ironically, it was New York's defeat of the impulse that created the utter desperation in 1787 that was necessary to generate momentum for a constitutional convention. The Articles of Confederation were now broken beyond repair. America needed a new constitution or it would fail. In 1786, Hamilton and James Madison had issued a formal call for a constitutional convention at a sparsely attended planning meeting in Annapolis. Madison had been taken aback when Hamilton pulled a draft constitution out of his pocket dated 1784. Hamilton had been planning this for a long time. As early as 1780, when he was an aide-de-camp, he had written to lawmakers urging them to form a new government. Historians credit Hamilton with being the first American to call for a constitutional convention. Among all the founders, Hamilton had the most radical and unswerving vision of a strong federal government at the head of a colossal, vigorous nation. Just as he dreamed of glory and power, he wished nothing less for America. He had not been a Virginian or a New Yorker and did not feel his primary loyalty as being to a state, but rather to a nation. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 should have been one of Alexander Hamilton's finest hours. As Emery wrote, the Constitutional Convention was Hamilton's child. No one had wanted it more than he did, or had fought for it so long. It was his hope for the transformation of the country from its state of disgrace and impotence into the great and mighty nation of his dreams. None of his biographers can fully explain what happened to Hamilton at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. More than one has suggested that he was in a disordered mental state of some kind. It's like he was on something, Kennedy told me. Emery wrote that Hamilton was restless and depressed during the convention, which suggests that Hamilton was once again in a mixed state, hypomanic and depressed at the same time. It was at these moments that he was most apt to do something self-destructive. The reason for his despair was much the same as it had been during the Revolution. He was watching America self-destruct, and despite his heroic efforts, felt helpless to do anything about it. Governor Clinton had to appoint Hamilton as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. As it was widely known that Hamilton was the New Yorker most qualified to go, but Clinton outsmarted Hamilton and his allies by sending him to the convention as one member of a three-man delegation. Under the rules adopted by the convention, the states voted as a unit, and within his own delegation, Hamilton was outvoted at every turn. Hamilton, a man of action, was forced to watch in silence as the New York vote went for measures he despised. Robert Yates and John Lansing, the two Clinton delegates, delighted in mocking Hamilton as they obstructed his plans for America. To make matters worse, the national delegates were choosing between two inadequate plans: the Virginia plan drafted by Madison and the New Jersey plan, which was little better than the Articles of Confederation. The stronger Virginia plan was missing a very necessary ingredient: an executive branch with any significance. After defeating the King of England, these politicians were so worried about potential dictators that they were almost paranoid. The Virginia plan proposed that one, or even worse, possibly three chief executives be selected by Congress for a one-year term. Hamilton had hoped that Washington, president of the convention, would back him in his nationalist proposals, but Washington confined his participation to rulings and to formal votes. Knowing that he would be the first president, Washington was paralyzed by an agony of self-consciousness, for fear of seeming to vote himself more power. Thus, Washington and Hamilton were unable to function as a team, despite the fact that they were on the same side of the battle and sitting only a few feet apart. Without Washington's modulating influence, Hamilton was prone to make errors in judgment. Hamilton and his political career was seldom able to function effectively without Washington as a guide and a reference. That guidance and restraint were missing here. For the first 3 weeks, Hamilton said little on the floor of the convention, which was odd in itself. Though he was silent, his mind was racing. In his notes, He often couldn't finish a sentence without stuttering a second, and then a third. Evidence that a flight of ideas strained his ability to think clearly. Hamilton felt impatient and restless. He had to do something. He impulsively decided on a bold stroke. He would present the convention with a solid plan. The heat was stifling that day, but Hamilton spoke for an astounding 6-hour stretch without a break, by far the longest speech at the convention. He proposed ideas that he admitted were radical. More than any other delegate, Hamilton had a vision of an energetic federal government. In his speech, he proposed that the president and senators be elected for life. In his notes, he wrote, ought to be hereditary. But fortunately, he had the presence of mind to omit that comment. He lavishly praised the British system of constitutional monarchy as the best in the world, and he hinted at abolishing all state power if the states were extinguished. He pronounced it would be no loss. In one speech, he managed to sound every possible alarm. Hamilton's close friend, Governor Morris, described the speech as an indiscretion that subjected him to censure. The speech would indeed plague him for the rest of his life. His enemies branded Hamilton a monarchist. There was concern that Hamilton had damaged not just himself but the cause. That speech was full of what we would call today killer sound bites for the opposition, Emery told me. Immediately after Hamilton spoke, Madison and the other nationalists jumped up to reassure the convention that Hamilton did not speak for them. Hamilton had become a minority of one. Hamilton then abruptly left the convention with no explanation beyond some oblique note to Washington. While some of the most important decisions in our history were being made in Philadelphia, Hamilton was attending to comparatively trivial legal work in New York. It wasn't like Hamilton to leave the field in the middle of battle. Clearly, he was not his normal self. As the meeting in Philadelphia began to look doomed, Washington missed his charging aide-de-camp. On July 10th, Washington wrote to Hamilton, "I'm sorry you went away. I wish you were back." In the end, Washington's strategy of dignified silence triumphed. The convention awarded the president the power he enjoys to this day, because when imagining a president, they looked across the room and saw George Washington. One delegate wrote that America would never have had an executive branch had not the members cast their eyes towards General Washington as president and shaped their ideas of the powers to be given to a new president by the opinion of his virtue. Hamilton returned to Philadelphia briefly to sign the completed Constitution, even though the finished product did not meet his specifications. No man's ideas were more remote from the plan than mine, he declared contemptuously. It was, he said, merely better than nothing, but if the country failed to ratify the Constitution, there would be no America. As Governor Morris put it, the only decision left was, shall there be a national government or not? The choice was between anarchy and convulsion.